Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to use Visual Studio and C#.net to create a close replica of the Windows calculator. First things first, let's jump in and go ahead and create a new project. We'll call it WinCalc. Now what this does, this creates a blank Windows form. If we ran this right now using the start button, the play button, what you'd get is just a very simple empty form, right? We haven't done anything with it yet. And what we're trying to recreate again is the Windows calculator. So let's modify a few things about the form itself that will get a little bit closer to looking like the calculator. Namely, we need to disable the maximize button. As you can see, that doesn't work here. We can remove this icon because I don't have a calculator icon to replace it with. We'll change the name of the form to calculator, and then we'll set it to our application to start in the middle of the screen, just so it stays within the viewing area of the recorder I'm using. Okay, so first things first, I have the form selected. When I have the form selected, you'll notice that the properties dialog box over here will populate with all the properties associated with this particular form. In your Visual Studio, you may have it shrunk or minimized, I should say. To open it, you can simply click on properties and pin it so that it stays open. Form 1 is the name of our form, but it's also the text that's showing in the label. So if we wanted to rename our form, we can simply type into this particular property that we want to call it calculator. Like I said, we don't have an icon for it, so I'm going to use the show icon property, and you can double click it or you can use the drop down menu and set it to false. Also, I said we wanted to disable the maximize box. That's a setting right here. So I'm simply going to double click that to change that to false. And then the very last thing I wanted to do was set the form to launch in the middle of the screen. So I think there is a set default location. Where is that at? Start position. So we're going to say center screen. Okay. And now if we run our form, after making those few modifications, you'll see the window launches right in the middle of my screen. The form title says calculator, and the maximize button is disabled. Okay, so easy enough. All right, so the next thing that we need to do is we need to add buttons to cover all of the functionality that we want to incorporate into our calculator. So it's really simple. Again, if this is minimized, you can simply click on your toolbox, pin it, and then start looking for a component. Yours might not look exactly like mine. Start looking for a component called button. You can either double click on this or you can drag and drop. Either way, it will add a button to your WinForm. Okay. Um, we're going to do a lot of copy and paste with the buttons because they're all basically the same size and shape and font and that sort of thing. So I'm going to go ahead and tweak this one button, and we'll start with number 1 since that makes sense. And then I'm going to make the size, or I'm sorry, the size of the button 45 by 45. And then I'm going to change the font. I'm going to make the font a little bit bigger. We'll bump it up to 14. Okay. So now we have a button, right? And what we want to do is we want to create a lot more of these buttons. So I'm simply going to copy and paste additional buttons and start kind of framing out where I want them to reside on my WinForm. Now, Visual Studio provides some auto alignment features that kind of snap in that you can use, or if you want to select multiple components on your WinForm, you can use some of the match size aligning functions that are available as well. So let's get these knocked out. And actually, we don't need this guy. This is going to be our 0 button, which if you look at the Windows calculator, um, is two columns wide. Okay, and then we have our equals button over here, right there. And these two spots we'll use for clear entry and clear. Okay. So now we basically have all of the buttons that we need on our form. I'm going to resize the form just a little bit and move this stuff down because the one thing we still have to put on here is a text field where we can show what the user types and provide the answer, that sort of thing. So if we go down here and we look at our list of components, if you scroll towards the bottom, you'll find something called a text box. So let's drag and drop that up here. And let's go ahead and change the font and make that bigger. So we'll say 16 maybe, try that. One thing we also want to do is initialize the value to show a 0. If you look at the Microsoft calculator, when you hit clear, no matter what you do, this always starts with 0. And then the last thing we want to do is with the text field is probably your last couple things. We want to make it the same size as our columns are wide. And then we want to align the text to the right so that our 0 will be on the right instead of the left. And now we can actually snuggle some of this stuff back up here and resize our form a little bit so that we kind of clean it up a little bit and make it look exactly how we want it to look. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is probably start thinking about changing the labels on some of these buttons, right? We don't want a calculator full of ones. So the first button down here being 0, let's go ahead and change that to 0. We know that my machine's freaking out. So we'll say 0, press enter. All right, this is going to be our decimal point. We have 1, then we have 2. As you get the picture, go ahead and rename all of these buttons. 5, 6. Okay, so now we have all the digits. Now we need to add the arithmetic operations. So we'll do divide, multiply, subtract, and of course add. We need to make this our equals button. This can be our clear button, and this can be our clear entry button. Okay. Now we have something that looks relatively similar to this. We're, excluding some of the functionality out here, but we have the core that we need to do a very simple calculator. Let's go ahead and run it, and we'll just make sure that our form looks like we expect it to look. Obviously, we can click all day long. Nothing really happens here. So the next thing we need to do is probably start thinking about how we're going to make these buttons fire events when we press them. Visual Studio makes this very, very simple. If you select a button and you click underneath the properties, you click on the lightning bolt there. It's the events that are available or associated with that particular component. What we care about is the click, naturally, right? When someone clicks something, we want our application to do something. So you can come in here and you can either specify a method, or very simply you can double click on the component itself and it will launch, Visual Studio will launch the code behind the form and then create the method for you. So this particular button is called button 7. So by default, it creates a method called button 7 click that then you can use to affect some change within your application. Speaking of the name of objects, let's go ahead and this text box gets the default text box 1 from Visual Studio when we dragged it onto our form. Let's go ahead and rename that so that it's a little more intuitive when we start referencing it later. So this text box is obviously going to show the result of our math problem or arithmetic operation that we complete with the calculator. So we're going to rename that to result. And back to our event handler for this button. If I press 1, what we want to have happen is we want 1 to be appended to our text box, right? So I just said that we renamed the instance of that text box to result. It has a property called text, which is how you would reference or change or modify the value that it's showing. And all we simply want to do is append, in this case, a 1 to our text box. So let's just try this now that we've done it for one button. If I press 1, I should see 1 get appended over and over and over and over and over again, right? Now, there are two ways that we could move forward. Actually, there's lots of ways, but there's two obvious ways that we could move forward. One is to create a button handler for each event, or for each button on our calculator here. The other would be to maybe get a little bit smarter and write a generic event handler that we can use for the same event handler for all buttons because they all basically function the same way, right? If we push this button, we want a 4 to show up here. If we push this button, we want a 5 to show up here. And oh, by the way, every label on each button has the number that we need to append to our text box up above. So instead of using button 7 click, I'm going to go back into my events and I'm just going to change it, get rid of the 7. We're going to create a generic button click method. And instead of appending a 1 to it, we want to actually append whatever value is on the label, essentially. Now, the nice thing about the event handlers here in Visual Studio, or I'm sorry, in C#.NET, is you get the button as that was pressed as a parameter to the method call. So when the event fires, this method gets called, and the button that fired the event is also sent as a parameter um, to the method. Now, it's sent as in the form of a generic object. So what we have to do before we do anything is we have to convert it to a button, because then we can begin to talk about button properties and button things. So to cast an object to a different data type is actually very simple, right? So this basically will take this sender object that has passed this method, it will convert it into a button, and we will now be able to reference that as B. So what we want to do is essentially the same, right? We want result.text to show whatever is already in that text box plus whatever label was pressed, right? Or if the button was pressed, right? So if we do this, we should see the same functionality as we did before with the 1, right? We're still appending to it, no problem. Now we haven't added this event handler to any other buttons, so that would be kind of the obvious next step, right? So we're going to take this button click method, and now we're going to apply it to every single button that makes sense, right? So all of our numbers in the decimal place, so that when we're done doing this and we run our application, the event handler will determine what button was pressed, it will retrieve the label from the button, and then it'll append it to our text box as we want it to. Okay, so let's run this now, and we should see 7, 8, 9, 3, right? So now this is functioning as we intended, and we only had to write one event handler to do it versus 10 or 11 different event handlers. Okay. I'm OCD, so that little 0 in front is kind of getting on my nerves right there. Mathematically, it doesn't really matter, but I don't want to see it. So let's create a little bit of logic in our event handler that says if result.text equals 0, let's just clear out result.text, right? Oops, clear result, clear, right? And now what this will do is simply when we press a button, if this is equal to 0 and only 0, we will get rid of the 0 now. We can still add zeros later, just to clean things up a little bit. Okay. The clear entry button is also a very simple button, right? We know what we need to do there. We simply just need to erase whatever's stored here, right? So let's go ahead and create an event handler for the CE button. So if you just double click on that, and all we simply want to do is change the text to 0, right? If we look at how this works, if I type something and I press clear entry, it just resets it back to 0. So we're going for the same kind of capability. So if we try this out, works like a champ. Okay. Next thing we need to do is begin to think about doing some math, right? So much like we did for these buttons, we can do something similar for these, where how we handle the event is going to be a little bit different, but these four are basically going to accomplish the same thing, just depending on what values on the label that we're using. So let's go back into our design mode. Let's click the plus button, and let's create a new event handler, and we'll call it operator click, right? And let's go ahead and apply that same event handler to all four of these buttons. Okay. Now, when an operator gets clicked in the Windows calculator, it basically we have to save off whatever value is stored in there. That way, when we start typing something else, we can complete the math when the equal button is pressed. So we'll need a couple variables to help us do this, right? So since we have a decimal place on our calculator, let's go ahead and use a double value, and we'll call it value, and we'll initialize it to 0. And then we also need to be able to capture what arithmetic operation was pressed, right? So let's create a string variable called operation and initialize that to nothing, just an empty string. Now, when we press operator.click, or I'm sorry, when we press the any of the operation buttons, what we want to do is we want to capture um, what button was pressed, right? So we want to understand whether it's add, subtract, multiply, or divide. We can do this exactly the same way that we did for the button clicks for the numbers. Only this time we're going to store the operation in the variable we just created, right? So b.text. So if I press plus, then operation will have a plus sign stored in it, right? And we'll use that in a moment when the equal button is pressed. What we also need to capture is the value that is in the result text field, right? Or text box. Now, if we do this, you're going to see we'll get the little red line because this is going to return a string. Value appears declared as a double. So we need to parse our string in as a double, right? So double.parse. And now what we have when we press an arithmetic operation button is we have value gets populated with what's ever in um, the text box, and then we're also capturing what operation we're pressing. I also want to understand that operator has been pressed or an operation has been pressed. So let's create another Boolean variable, and you'll see how we'll use this in a minute. We'll call it operation pressed, and we'll set it to false. Now, when our operator is clicked, we want to obviously make that to true, right? So operation press is going to become true. Because the reason we want to do this, right? If we don't do that, when we start pushing numbers and we hit plus, and then we begin typing again, it's going to keep appending to whatever we have typed here, which we don't want to have happen, right? We want this to reset itself, and when we start typing, we want to start typing a fresh number, a new number. So what we can do is based on this Boolean variable, we can pair it here to determine whether or not we should clear the value that's already in the text field, right? So if the result.text is 0, if the text box has a 0 in it, we're going to clear it before we start typing again or showing the numbers and appending numbers to it. Or if a number was just pressed, or I'm sorry, an arithmetic operation was just pressed, we want to append, or I'm sorry, start over. We don't want to just append to this number, okay? Let's see, where are we at? Oops. Okay, so now when the operator is clicked, we capture that value, we save it off, and then we basically have determined which operation is pressed. Now we need to write an event handler for the equals button, right? So I'm going to double click on the equals button. And what we have now is we know that we need to add whatever was stored in value, or we need to do something with whatever stored in value and whatever is currently showing in our text field because the user ostensibly has typed in another number. The reason, or the way that we'll know what operation we need to do on it is based on what's stored in this operation variable, right? So the first thing we can do is create a switch statement, and we're going to switch on operation. And we'll have 5 different cases, well really 4. We'll have addition, where we'll say result, where we're going to show the result of value, which is what we stored when the operator was first clicked, plus the same thing we have here, right? Double.parse, whatever is currently in our text field. And then we're going to break, right? This is yelling at me because this is going to return a double, and you can only store strings into a text field, so we'll use our toString method there. Okay. So let's copy and paste here, right? We're going to do basically the same thing for multiply, divide, and subtract. So we'll just modify these slightly. So here we want to subtract, here we want to multiply, and here we want to divide. And then this should never happen, but we'll include it anyways. Okay. The next thing we need to do, so this should handle all of our math, right? And this is going to show the result to the screen. What we also want to probably do is reset this variable right here, right? So let's go ahead and set that back to false so that we'll get the expected outcome we're looking for. Okay, so let's try this. All right, if we do 7 plus 5, we get 12. If we do 12 minus 3, we get 9. 9 times 2 is 18. 18 divided by 3 is 6. Good. So everything's working as we hope for, right? We have our clear button, clear entry button, which works. We haven't hooked this button up yet, so let's probably take care of that next. If we go back into our design mode, let's double click on the clear button. With this button, basically all we need to do is clear the text box, right? Oops. And then we also need to, if there's any value set in value, if there's anything stored there, we need to reinitialize that to 0, right? That takes care of that button. The Windows calculator has a kind of a nice feature, right? So if you push 7 or a number and an operator, it actually shows you what that operator or operation is, right? And then when you complete the math, you just get the value. So let's go ahead and recreate that as well. I'm going to go back to my toolbox, and I'm going to grab a label, and I'm going to drag and drop it on my screen here, or on my form. I'm going to change the font a little bit. Let's get some slightly larger font, maybe 13. You'll notice this has the label by default has a background color associated with it. So let's go look at our background color option and make it something that's white. So window. And then let's go ahead and change the text color as well to like a light gray. That's a little dark still. Maybe something like that. Okay. And then let's position it inside our area there. Okay. Last thing with the label is we don't want it to say label. We want it to say nothing. And let's give it a new name, and let's call it, instead of label 1, let's call it equation. Okay, so what happens with the Windows calculator is when something that doesn't actually show up until an operator is pressed, right? So if we go back to our operator click, we can basically very simply say equation dot text equals what? Value, and we're going to concatenate the operator, right? Operation. And when we press the equals button, right, which incidentally is named button 16, we want to reset equation to blank, right? I guess I have to do it this way. Okay. Now let's run this. And this should pretty much cover all of our bases, right? 8 plus, you'll notice that shows up, 6 equals 14, and it disappears when we press enter. 14 plus 36, if we hit clear, there's a bug right there, right? You can't do multiple digit numbers. Let's fix that. And I think that problem is here. I think we need to move him to the top. Let's see if that fixes our problem. 8 plus 3, nope, still a problem. Let's comment him out. All right, 9 times 3 equals 27 divided by 3, 9 plus 10. Uh-oh. So if operation pressed is true, we want to clear it. So this should actually work. I'm not sure why that didn't like that. Oops. So when we press, oh, I have that in the wrong. I have it in the wrong spot. That should be right. So when I press equals, right, that's how this works. 7 plus 36 equals, and clear. So if I press this button, let's play it. 5 plus 66. It won't let me because I have that. So let's see, 66. See, that works, right? I guess there's an easier way to do this maybe. So if we don't want to, let's comment this out. This should solve that problem. 8 plus 14. Oh, see, there's the initial problem, right? We want to clear once we press an operator. So we need that there, because if we don't have that there, we have problems. But when we do have it there, we also have problems. Oops. And this would be OR. All right. So we press an operator. We want that to change to true, which we do. Now the user will start typing again. Ah, that's the problem. Here's where we need to start. Maybe if we do it this way. Let's get him out of there, and let's put him here. Let's see if that solves our problem. All right, 8 plus 36 equals 44. There we go. That solved the problem. Had that in the wrong spot. There you go. Troubleshooting as you build a Windows WinForm app. Okay, so we'll leave it there. Everything, I just saw another issue. So we don't want to clear, we want to set this to 0, because that's how Windows does it. Now if we 98 clear, we get 0. Okay. So there's lots of other things you could maybe tweak to make this better. You can add functionality, you can add buttons, you can limit the size here. You guys can mess with that as you see fit. Just get in there and monkey with the properties with the form. There's lots of good stuff you can do. So give this a try, and hopefully you won't run into any issues as you try and build this out yourself. Thanks and take care.